I've known Michael Homer for many years and have always respected him for his intellect, his historical interest, and his scholarship. He has done many articles, and he's done several books. I'll show you a couple of those. As I said, I don't know where that copy of Dialogue is that we had, but right here. Thank you. This is the one that has the 100-plus page, as I called it earlier, a seminal work on this subject of Freemasonry and Mormonism. This has been really the best thing to date, even though there have been entire books done on the subject. This was the best thing that you could find, the best work on the subject, with all respect to the other authors who have tried to tackle that. No one has achieved it as Michael Homer has. He's done some, he's done other work on the way to somewhere else, which we don't even have a copy to show you because it's out of print in cloth, and we sold the last of our paperback copies. Travel accounts from people who came to Utah back in the 19th century. Mike edited this work, published by the Arthur H. Clarke Company in the series, what is the series?
Kingdom in the West.
Kingdom in the West. It would not come to me. I told you about the many years that I've been doing this. And Will Bagley's the general editor of that series. A fine book. And one thing that I'm sure a lot of people don't know is Mike is a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. He is an expert on Arthur Conan Doyle, has done a number of things on that subject, including this book, Angels of Darkness, a drama in 3 acts, Arthur Conan Doyle. There are a number of, it has the entire work in there, and then there are other essays, including by Mike, on Doyle and the Mormons. He's published in other areas articles. We have a couple of limited editions. I should have a table here, shouldn't I? And I'm almost done here, folks. This is James Bertosh, missionary journal that was done in a regular edition, but also in this limited leather-bound, beautiful edition. A Tangled Skein, which is more Doyle. Also done in a this is a one of 26 lettered editions. I don't even know, I don't know Mike's entire bibliography, but everything he's produced has been quality, and as I said earlier, I admire him as a scholar and as a person. He's a man of integrity, and he's the one you want to hear from. So I'd like to now turn the time over to Michael Homer.
Thank you, Kurt.
Let's see if that works.
And I appreciate very much Kurt and Benchmark Books for hosting this event this evening. This is truly a remarkable bookstore. And can everybody hear? Are we okay there? And also I'd like to thank Glenn DeConner and John Alley of the University of Utah Press, who worked so hard to prepare and get this book out. Kurt mentioned that I like to study Arthur Conan Doyle, and my confession tonight is I always slip him into every book I write, regardless of whether he belongs there or not. So you will see a reference to Arthur Conan Doyle in this book, as a matter of fact, who by the way, was a Freemason, and whose book, A Study in Scarlet, which is about, which is really a shilling shocker about territorial Utah, has a Masonic reference into it. So if you haven't read Studying Scarlet, you need to read that. You also can look up this reference. I thought this evening that I'd summarize a bit and I would like to honor Kurt's statement that I'm going to keep my remarks under 30 minutes and then invite some Q&A. Summarize what the book is about and then emphasize a couple of entries that have some relevance to events that are happening today, and then open it up for questions. The name of the book, Joseph's Temples, The Dynamic Relationship Between Freemasonry and Mormonism. Obviously, the reference Joseph Temples refers to first the Kirtland Temple, which was constructed in Kirtland, Ohio, and the Nabu Temple. And most of the references to temple rituals and connections with Freemasonry, of course, historically have related to the Nabu Temple. And that's really the first thing that people think about when they hear the dynamic relationship between Freemasonry and Mormonism. And part of the reason for that is not because of outsiders who noted the connection, but by the participants in the Holy Order themselves, from Joseph Smith to Heber C. Kimball to Joseph Fielding and others. They made no secret among themselves that Joseph taught that there was a connection, in essence, a restoration of the ritual practiced in Solomon's Temple, which appeared in a fallen apostate form in the lodges of Freemasonry. This was, of course, followed up by Brigham Young and others, Heber C. Kimball, who continued to make references to the connection in Utah Territory. Brigham Young made some very specific references when he dedicated Temple Square for the building of the temple in 1853, and then again just prior to his death when he dedicated or participated in the dedication of the St. George Temple. There's very specific references to this connection. And throughout Utah Territory, church officials were not reluctant to make the connection, including some of the most dramatic references that I refer to in the book were made by Franklin D. Richards, who referenced Masonic legends and how they fit into the idea that there had been a restoration of that rite. Things began to change a bit after the in post-manifesto period, because the main reason is because the Utah Masons, who were all non-LDS and who did not want to invite the old Nabu Masons into their lodges, raised the bar based on the Mormon practice of polygamy, and basically said, if you're lawbreakers, you don't qualify to enter our lodges. So in the post-manifesto period, after polygamy was phased out from roughly 1890 to 1904 and thereafter, both the Mormons and the Masons had to reevaluate. One, the Mormons had to figure out, do we really want to push it now and become Masons and say the prohibition that was raised is now gone, and the Masons had to figure out, well, do we want to now invite them into our lodges? And both decided, no, we do not. The Mormons, beginning in the 1910s, began to develop a new thesis concerning the relationship between Freemasonry and Mormonism, and it essentially was Joseph Smith joined Masonry for fraternal reasons, to connect with others in Illinois, to make friends, and that the ritual introduced in Nabu was a result of revelation and really had no connection with Freemasonry, except insofar as there were traces of the ritual practice in Solomon's Temple in the Masonic lodges. That new rationale prompted the Utah Masons to respond, and in 1921, really the first study of the relationship as such was published and authored by Sam Goodwin, who is the Grand Secretary of the Grand Lodge of Utah, where he discussed the connection and essentially said, well, Mormons are no longer polygamous, but there's all kinds of other reasons why they should not become Masons. So one of which, ironically, was, well, they don't believe in a Christian God, which, of course, those of you who are Masons understand that that's not really a requirement, whether they did or didn't. So he published that book in 1921, and that, of course, gained the attention of a lot of folks, including some of the same individuals who had been talking about the relationship, and that resulted in 1934, and this is 80 years ago this year, that Anthony W. Ivins, who he actually wrote the book and died before it was published, Mormonism and Masonry, which really became a quasi-official church response, and by Ivins' telling, was really not written for members of the LDS Church as much as it was written as a response to Goodwin's book. And Ivins basically said two things. I mean, it's actually, there's some wonderful things in the book, because he actually went out and studied things about Freemasonry that I don't think any Mormon had really, other than, of course, the early Nabu Masons had studied during the 20th century. But his thesis was really two things. One, Joseph Smith received the Temple Endowment through revelation. Two, there is no connection between Freemasonry and Mormonism. Wrote the book. It was published posthumously, and that became really the standard work on this subject, and was not really responded to until, ironically, 40 years ago this year, when a very high-ranking Mormon educator, Reed Durham, and those of you who have studied this subject know that he was no wielding flower. He got up as the past president of the Mormon History Association and gave a very compelling speech on the relationship between Freemasonry and Mormonism. One of the things that he said, in fact, this was at the beginning of the speech, he spoke, of course, about the similarities between the rituals, which was the thing that interested most people, but he also opened up a big door, which I think all persons who study in this area have to recognize. He said, I am convinced that in the study of Masonry lies the pivotal key to future understanding of Joseph Smith and the church. And he did not limit that to understanding the connection between the rituals. Now, when I first began my studies, one of the voids that I saw was that there's really no attempt to discuss Freemasonry. And in that connection, study the difference between operative Freemasonry and speculative Freemasonry, which was really ushered in with the organization of the London Grand Lodge. To study the operation of Freemasonry from really a Christian group in its operative stage to more bound by the principles of the Enlightenment when speculative Freemasonry was organized. To study the craft degrees, the ancient Masonry, which was really a schism from the Grand Lodge of London, the Royal Arch, which were among the first. Of course, when speculative Freemasonry started, there were 2 degrees. So when they talk about high degrees, they also include the 3rd degree, the Master Mason's degree, the Royal Arch, the exportation of Freemasonry to the continent first, and the development of the high degrees in France, including adoptive rituals in which women were included in the degrees of Freemasonry. And then finally, the importation of Freemasonry to America, where after the Revolution, there was an attempt to re-Christianize Freemasonry from Enlightenment ideas to infuse Christianity back, which was one of the main reasons that the anti-Masonic movement began. It really began as a sectarian pushback on the idea of re-Christianization. So, those are the things that in the first 60 pages of the book, as John Halley's pointed out to me, I don't mention Mormonism once, maybe a couple of times. But I thought that that was important to lay that foundation. But in addition, I try to benefit from some of the study that Reed Durham did and identify what are the other dynamic relationships between Freemasonry and Mormon beyond the temple ritual. Now, one of the relationships is well known, and in fact it was identified as far back as, in fact, even before the connection with the temple ritual. And of course, that's the passages in the Book of Mormon that men like Alexander Campbell believed were anti-Masonic in origin. And of course, others, Jason Whitman, E.D. Howe, Roy Sutherland, all wrote about this in the 1830s. That debate continues today, quite frankly. And so it won't surprise you to know that there's articles written on both sides of that issue. Among the other connections, the gold plate narrative, which was identified by Reed Durham, and that is the similarity between Joseph Smith's narrative concerning the gold plates, which was first reduced to writing in 1832, and Enoch's dream in the legends of Freemasonry, in which he created a gold plate. The high priesthood and the creation of the high priesthood and the initial endowment in Kirtland, not the endowment that we think of as having been introduced in the Kirtland Temple, but the endowment which Joseph Smith introduced to the high priesthood in the early 1830s. In addition, the design of the Kirtland Temple and the purification rituals that are associated with that endowment. And finally, the last two connections that I think deserve some attention and are particularly relevant in the early 21st century are the exclusion, is the policy adopted to exclude African descendants from priesthood and temples, and I think the exclusion from the temples was probably the driving force here, as well as the creation of the Relief Society and the eventual inclusion of women in the endowment. Now, I would argue that it is ironic that these last two connections relating to race and gender were impacted by the transition in church leadership from Joseph Smith to Brigham Young. Although Smith did not exclude blacks from the priesthood, he did not admit any blacks into the Holy Order before his death. There simply weren't that many blacks in the church, of course. In addition, he believed much of the folklore, which had Masonic undertones, that Brigham Young relied on to rationalize the exclusionary policy that he institutionalized. Similarly, Smith seemed sympathetic to admitting women as full partners into the Holy Order, which is reminiscent of French lodges of adoption that included both men and women. Nevertheless, Young made it clear after the Nabu temple was completed and thousands of church members had received their endowments that women did not hold the priesthood, and Young excluded them from participating in prayer circles after the saints arrived in Utah. Now, the apparent chasm between Smith's and Young's thinking on these issues, race and gender, may be clarified by reviewing connections between Masonry and Mormonism on those issues. And so I thought for the rest of the time, I would talk briefly about those two issues and then open it up for questions. Blacks in the priesthood. I have argued elsewhere that there is a connection between the Masonic policy of excluding blacks from their temples and the Mormon policy was institutionalized by Brigham Young. And I think in order to see that connection clearly, one has to look at the folklore which was taught by both Mormons and Masons, and then connect that up to the policies that were later instituted. The Masonic folklore and legends is clear that the initial Grand Lodge taught as part of their legends that Cain and Ham were Freemasons. And quite frankly, if you look at some of the anti-Masonic literature that came out shortly thereafter, the non-Masons made fun of that, saying, well, if you let the descendants of Cain and Ham as part of your lodges, then what kind of an organization do you have? The ancient Masons, as I mentioned earlier, was really a schism organized in the 1750s from the Grand Lodge. Crafted a legendary history of Masonry in which Cain's and Ham's descendants were not true Masons, and instead practiced a spurious or irregular form of Masonry. The legendary history published by the ancients was adopted and taught by American Masons. The Masonry in America was really more of an ancient, there were of course moderns in the U.S., but it was very impacted by ancient Freemasonry. American Masons thereafter adopted a policy which prohibited blacks based on, in part by this legend, of course racial prejudice was primary, there's no questioning that, but justifications for keeping them out were based on, among other things, these legends from being admitted into their temple rituals, including the Royal Arch, in which Masons became high priests, prophets, and kings. This Masonic policy forced blacks to organize their own lodges, which the white Masons then considered to be irregular and spurious. In other words, they would say, well, yeah, you're the descendants of Cain, and you're practicing a spurious ritual just like he did. In 1846, after Mormons were expelled from the Grand Lodge of Illinois, there's no real connection with their expulsion and what happened, but just to give you an idea of chronologically when it occurred, the Illinois Grand Lodge institutionalized a written policy that prohibited men of African descent from becoming Masons. This was soon followed by similar written policies in most other jurisdictions in America, North and South. It didn't really matter whether these individual Masons believed in the freedom of freeing blacks from slavery or not. This was, a policy which really projected throughout the United States. This policy was premised, other than the racial prejudice, which I think is really at the heart of most of these exclusionary policies, on the ancient landmarks, which the first Grand Lodge adopted in Great Britain, which required candidates to be free-born. And the American Masons believed that since one had to be free-born in order to be a Mason, then all blacks were ineligible and would remain eligible because they were cursed. Now, to compare this to the Mormon exclusionary policy, one has to recognize that Joseph Smith very early on taught very similar legends concerning the descendants of Cain. In 1831, he translated the Book of Enoch, which included passages which taught that Cain's descendants were cursed with a black skin. Enoch beheld the residue of the people, which were the sons of Adam, and they were a mixture of all the seed of Adam, save it was the seed of Cain. For the seed of Cain were black and had not a place among them. But Smith's translation also revealed that Satan and Cain entered into a secret alliance, and that Cain was a, quote, master Mahon. If you think about that, there would probably be no reason for that to be transcribed as Master Mahon if, in fact, the intention was Master Mason. And remember, in these legends, Masonic legends, there were Grand Masters and Master Masons going all the way back to Adam, and also to the Solomon's Temple, of course. So I believe that the use of the Master Mahon title is consistent with Masonic folklore that Cain's descendants practiced spurious form of Masonry. In 1835, of course, Smith translated portions of the Book of Abraham, the portion related to Abraham in Egypt, in which it was revealed that the descendants of Ham were not eligible for the priesthood. And in 1845, and then of course Joseph Smith dies, and we all know in this room that Joseph Smith was the president of the church at a time when several blacks were not only baptized into the church but were ordained. In 1845, the Times and Seasons published an article which concluded that the descendants of Ham were cursed with black skin, which has ever been a curse that has followed an apostate of the holy priesthood. And in 1849, of course, Young declared, "The Lord God has cursed Cain's seed with blackness," which is not only consistent with Masonic legends, but also Smith's earlier teaching as set forth in the Book of Moses. And he continued saying that this prohibited them from the priesthood. And of course he also included the endowment, and this seems consistent with the American Masonic policy which prevented African Americans from entering into Masonic temples. This pronouncement institutionalized the Mormon policy of preventing men of African descent and their wives from being endowed. But I think significantly, Young did not strip previously ordained black men of their priesthood, even if they were not allowed to enter the endowment house. So I think that the connection there with Masonry becomes stronger because of Young's perhaps understanding that the priesthood one speaks of in connection with the endowment was different than the institutional priesthood to which men were ordained. Finally, in 1852, Parley Pratt noted that Ham's descendants practice a spurious religion and priesthood. He said they pretended to have received it from Ham, and this he's talking about the pharaohs and their priests. Hence we find a government in Egypt of mere human origin, and a priesthood and religion by law established which worship several gods. Again, I believe this is consistent with Masonic legends that Cain's descendants did not have priesthood and practice a form of spurious masonry. Now the second connection that I think even has some relevance given the events of the last couple of weeks at Utah, and believe me, I'm not arguing whether women did or did not have the priesthood or should or shouldn't in the modern context, but it's also interesting to note that this is not the first time this has been argued, of course, within the context of Mormonism. First, in women in the priesthood, let's look at adoptive Freemasonry. And I mentioned in British Freemasonry, no women could be initiated as Freemasons or participate in Masonic rituals. And this again was based on the ancient landmarks that said that you had to be a man to be a Mason. Nevertheless, despite this prohibition, Masonic historians, some Masonic historians argue that some of the English rituals that were introduced in about the 1720s allowed both men and women to be initiated as, quote, real Masons. These rituals were exported to France and adapted and became what is now known as the adoptive rituals. One Masonic historian has pointed out similarities between those British rituals which were exposed in 1744 and adoptive rituals which were introduced around 1763 in Paris and then exposed in London in 1765 and in Paris in 1772. These rituals included a narrative which was centered on the Garden of Eden drama, and women were obligated to keep secrets. Jan Snowick, who is one of the Masonic historians that makes this argument, has concluded that women who were initiated into these rituals became real Freemasons on the same par as men. when they were initiated into these French adoptive lodges. But when the Grand Orient of France, which is what they call their Grand Lodge in France, took control of these lodges, and of course the Grand Lodge was a male-only organization, they took control of the lodges. They made them into adoptive lodges where the lodges were adopted in to the Grand Orient. They were female-only rituals, and the women who participated in the rituals did not become real Freemasons, and therefore could not visit any of the other lodges that were male-only. In 1827, during the Morgan affair, an expose of the French adoptive ritual was introduced in Boston, or published in Boston rather, after the disappearance of William Morgan, and it included the Garden of Eden drama. In 1831, another anti-Masonic writer, Avery Allen, claimed that American Masons were organizing adoptive lodges similar to the French model, but they were not intended to make women real Masons. Rather, they were intended to obligate them to keep secrets. In other words, during the Morgan affair, when people were being called in and questioned and Masonry was under attack, it was thought prudent to place the women under obligation as well. Well, of course, that's similar to Joseph Smith's thoughts when he started introducing the concept of plural marriage. He understood that this was an explosive new doctrine, and he organized the Female Relief Society in 1842, the day after and in the same room where he was made a Master Mason. Smith informed the sisters that he was going to make out of the society a kingdom of priests, as in Enoch's day, as in Paul's day. He also spoke of respecting the priesthood and of delivering the keys to the society in the church. Newell K. Whitney advised the society that it takes all to restore the priesthood, and Smith cautioned the sisters to be, quote, good Masons and to keep secrets. And he promised them that women would be included in the Holy Order. Well, it soon became clear to Smith and others in the hierarchy that there was no way that there's going to be secrets kept in the Relief Society. There were, within a few years, and this is not a reference to modern Relief Society. I don't want to make that reference. This is a reference to an organization that soon had over 1,000 members. And Joseph kept, you read the minutes of the Relief Society, it's interesting, Joseph kept on saying, slow down, because they were basically moving at the same pace as the Nabu Lodge and the other Mormon lodges were. And by the time that Freemasonry and the Mormon lodges ended, there were over 1,000 Masons that had been initiated as well. So at some point in time, Joseph understood, well, it's time to incorporate the inner circle into the Holy Order. And so in 1843, Smith admitted the first woman into the Holy Order, of course, Emma Smith, which, like the adoptive rituals, included a Garden of Eden drama. Smith and other Mormon authorities made statements during this period that the priesthood is for the sisters as well as the brethren, and the Willard Richards and Joseph Smith and others made such statements. And so there seems to be at least a female-friendly attitude that was expressed by Joseph Smith and others. And believe me, I know that there's literature that argues against this concept that Joseph Smith had any intention of bestowing equality to women by initiating them into the Holy Order. Nevertheless, the similarities of the Mormon ritual with the adoptive rituals, as well as Smith's suggestive comments, offer some intriguing evidence concerning Smith's intentions. The Relief Society, even though it lacked a ritual, was similar to female lodges of adoption in the sense that the society was a separate female organization which arguably received priesthood keys. But when it became apparent that Smith's goal of maintaining secrecy through that society was not being fulfilled, he began to admit select women into the previously male-only Holy Order. As I note in Joseph's Temples, if Smith's inclusion of men and women in the same ritual was consistent with Masonic historians' conclusion that the original intention of the French adoptive lodges, in other words, to make real Masons out of women, then he may have believed, at least at that time, that endowed women held the priesthood. In other words, they were Freemasons in a comparative sense. On the other hand, if the Mormon prophet or successors intended that women be adopted into the Holy Order in order to subject them to the same obligations of secrecy as their husbands, particularly concerning the emerging practice of plural marriage, which has been argued by many, which, by the way, was the intention of the American Masons who created adoptive lodges during the Morgan affair, then the model may be more similar to the French adoptive rituals after the Grand Orient began to control those lodges. Of course, Smith's successors, beginning with Brigham Young, end the debate, inasmuch as they vehemently insisted that women did not and do not hold the priesthood. Now, one more point before I open it up to questions. Joseph Smith was really ahead of himself in admitting women into the Holy Order because in 1893, a group of French Freemasons, now remember, adoptive Freemasonry up until 1893 really was all about adoption and not making real Masons. And if a woman was initiated into an adoptive lodge, she wasn't really a Mason. It was an auxiliary. But in 1893, a group of French Freemasons organized a new Masonic obedience, which has since been imported to America, and I believe even has lodges, at least from this same strain of Masonry, has lodges in Utah, and which admits both men and women who are initiated as Freemasons, and who go through the same ritual and are considered Freemasons, real Masons in the sense of that term. Now, Franz is our friend here that is from, I know that there were several people at another event that...
there is an organization called the International Masonic Order Delphi from Greece that has a chapter here, I guess is what it's called.
Right.
So men and women join.
Yeah. I'm sure those of you who are well versed in the subject probably know that Masonic historians are very aware of Joseph Smith's inclusion of women in his ritual, and they make note of the fact that he was really at the cutting edge of this whole issue of creating a form of co-educational Freemasonry. So, in conclusion, the book attempts to go and set a foundation by talking about the organization of Freemasonry in England, its exportation to the continent, the experiences of American Freemasons, their attempts to re-Christianize the craft from around 1800 to 1826. The anti-Masons who wrote a lot of literature pushing back on that particular issue, and I'm sure you've all heard the argument, Masonry is not a religion, but in the early 1800s, of course, there were pastors who were Masons who were making just the opposite argument, that the ritual being practiced in Freemasonry needed to be grafted in to Christian denominations as a way for illumination and to help church members return to God's presence. The last chapter in the book talks about what is the significance of these connections, and I think that chapter is going to continue to be written. Some historians argue that all of the connections are superficial, that there may be this and that which you can compare to the system, but it's not, there really wasn't a deep-seated connection. And I think we get back to the difference between Anthony W. Ivins and Reed Durham on this issue. If one believes that Joseph Smith received a revelation of Freemasonry, which was the endowment, which was devoid of any environmental influence, as Ivan's obviously did, then you make the argument that there is no connection. Obviously, historians like Reed Durham and others would argue, and if you go back and read Durham's article, he did not say that Joseph Smith didn't receive the endowment by revelation. He underlined many different times, yes, he did. But he also recognized that he was influenced, like most prophets or seers, by his environment, and that you're going to see connections with what was happening during his lifetime and what he wrote. So I encourage you to buy the book, make these guys over here happy. Any questions you all have? Although one could argue that the account written in the Times and Seasons was probably penned by John Taylor. Yes, sir.
Did you, in your study, find any exposure that Joseph Smith had to Freemasonry as early as Palmyra? It's been said that Joseph Sr. and Hiram were both Masons.
Yeah.
And Joseph Smith ended up marrying William Morgan's widow.
Yes.
Became one of his 4 wives. Did you find any Masonry connection there?
Yes. Everybody hear the question? Yes, on the first question was, now you mentioned Morgan and I got excited.
Yeah, you know, his exposure to Masonry
Right.
as early as Palmyra.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Hiram was obviously a Freemason. I think it's unclear when he was initiated, but probably around 1823. I personally do not believe that Joseph Smith Sr. was a Mason, because there's just no evidence for it. There's one membership roster in, I think it's Canandaigua, but I could be wrong, but it's clearly not in the area where he was living at the time with his family. I think it was 1818, where a Joseph Smith was initiated. Now the problem with saying, well, that must be Joseph Sr. is because there's a lot of those Joseph guys out there. Okay.
And Smiths.
Yeah,
Joseph
and
Smith.
well, Smiths, of course, yes. That's like Rossi in Italian, right? As to the Morgan thing, there, of course, Kurt has a lot of other books that talk about polygamy in the church, and several of them mention Lucinda Morgan as probably someone that Joseph had an interest in as early as far west. I don't think, well, we know that they weren't married legally, and I don't think that there's any evidence that they were sealed until Joseph was killed, and then she was sealed to Joseph in the Nabu temple. Her husband, does everybody know who Lucinda Morgan was? She was the widow of William Morgan. She married George Washington Harris, yeah, George Washington Harris, who was the landlord basically for the family before William disappeared, probably over Niagara Falls. And they were converted in Indiana, I believe by Orson Pratt, and then moved far west. That's where they encountered Joseph Smith, and she obviously had very strong connection with the Mormon prophet. But I don't think they were ever married. Yes.
Some of us are of the opinion that magic and the occult played a part in early Mormonism. You also find a track or a trail through early Masonry as well?
Yeah, I don't hold myself out as having done a lot of study in that area. Of course, I've read.
You run across anything?
Yeah, I've read Mike Quinn's book, of course, which is the seminal book. And, Gary, you'd probably sell him a copy of that, right, if you have any more copies hanging around. But one of the weaknesses, I think, of Reed Durham's article is that he talks about things that I think are really fringy. If you're talking about the connection between Freemasonry and Mormonism, I think you need to keep the discussion centered. And he talks about some of the same things that Mike Quinn. I don't think they have a real strong Masonic connection to them. I think that they've been overemphasized by anti-Masons, because of course they're trying to prove that these guys are magic. I mean, the same thing that people say about Mormonism. I mean, there's a lot of connections between anti-Masonry and anti-Mormonism, quite frankly. One of the first guy that was both was E.D. Howe. When the Mormons moved into Ohio, Howe was absolutely convinced that all Mormons were Masonically charged. He didn't believe anything when it came to Alexander Campbell. Even though he printed Campbell's pamphlet, he didn't believe that those were anti-Masonic passages in the Book of Mormon. But then when he switched brands, when anti-Masonry went downhill, he switched brands and became an anti-Mormon, and was, of course, much more successful at it. But there may be connections there that could be developed, but I'm not versed on it. Yeah, Gary?
Mike, would you summarize briefly your conclusions regarding the dependence of the Nabu endowment ceremony on Freemasonry?
Now, on Freemasonry, or?
Well, or the relationship between the two.
Yeah, the relation, in terms of, well, I do think that Joseph Smith was familiar to some degree with both Masonry's legends and history and rituals long before he became a Mason himself. And became a Mason in 1842, of course, in March 13 and 15, I believe, 1842. And his brother was a Mason. He was very good friends with Newell Whitney in Kirtland, who was not only a member of the craft, but also a Royal Arch Mason. So he had some connection there. Here's what I think. I think that Joseph, when he was growing up in upstate New York, saw two parallel lines developing. One, known as the Second Great Awakening. He saw everything going on in terms of restorationism, and we need to restore back to the primitive church. At the same time, he was right in the middle of the anti-Masonic movement. And that battle was over how much of a role should religion play in Freemasonry. And he, I believe, based on the evidence that I see, was in line with men like Salem Town and others who said we need to re-Christianize Freemasonry and align it with the Christian denominations. In other words, the dream was that we don't have a ritual anymore in our churches, and so we need to have a ritual, and they thought this idea of having the primitive ritual as practiced in Solomon's Temple was something they should strive for. And of course, you read the anti-Masonic literature, they really push back on that. And most of the initial anti-Masons, before it was taken over by the politicians, were pastors and ministers or somehow aligned with the churches. So I think that was what he thought in his mind, and so I do believe, based on his own statements to his inner circle in Nabu, believed that the temple endowment that he revealed was a restoration of the endowment that had been practiced in primitive times, and more specifically in Solomon's Temple. And so you see references to new knowledge being restored that was actually lost at the time the Solomon's Temple was being built, according to Masonic legend, when Hiram Abief was killed by 3 ruffians, and that the only way that they restored that word was they found this shaft built below Solomon's Temple where Enoch had placed a gold plate that had the name of God on it. And I believe that Joseph believed that he had restored the ritual, and that it was essentially the same ritual that had been practiced in primitive times. So I think that that was really a way of combining those two parallel strands that we'd grown up with, where Freemasonry was restored to its pristine condition, and Christianity was restored to its pristine condition, and he accomplished what they were both trying to do, well, not both trying to do, but some in both organizations, and that is meld the ritual with the celebration of the religion. Yes?
Are there still significant numbers of people that would argue for total partition? Like that there are either culture that would say there was no connection whatsoever?
Oh, sure. I mean, but I think that in Mormonism, of course, there's still historians in Mormonism who would argue that there's no that a prophet can filter out his environment, right? And that as such, what you see in print is the pure revelation, and it has no environmentalism. Ironically, B.H. Roberts, who argued that there was no connection between Mormonism and Masonry, I mean, vehemently argued that. He was also one who argued that when you look at all of the criticisms being placed on the Book of Mormon and 19th century things that you may see from time to time, page to page, he would argue that those were a reflection of Joseph Smith's environment, and that you can't filter those things out. So I've always found that's quite.
Can you explain that? Why did he just not have time to rework that idea?
Explain what?
Why he seems to be taking a different position on
Why a historian would argue that there's no environmental connection? I think that people that want, in law we have what's called result-oriented writing, that if you know what conclusion you want to come to, then you move backwards and make the arguments. Of course, as lawyers, we're supposed to argue a particular side, so that's much easier. I think that some historians think that in order to protect the product, that they have to deny any influence from the prophet's environment. And I don't think that there's a lot of biblical historians, and I think most Mormon historians would now say that that's not the case. But there are. I mean, you asked me if there's anybody out there. I'm sure there are.
Well,
People.
I'm curious as to why Roberts could.
Yeah, I find it curious too, but he may have been given the assignment to write the article. So sometimes that's important as well. Yes, sir.
Do you know how many presidents of the church have been Masons, or how long it was?